To become a member and to learn more about the society, you can check out torreybotanical.org or follow us on social media. We're at Torrey Botanical on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky, or at Torrey Botanical Society on YouTube, where we post recordings of lectures. Going to stop sharing and introduce our speaker this evening, Clara Holmes, who's a plant ecologist with New York City Parks. Clara earned their master's from Pace University and bachelor's from the College of Charleston before working with New York City Parks. She managed seed collection projects around the Mid-Atlantic as the seed collection coordinator for the Mid-Atlantic Regional Seed Bank. She has over a decade of experience in plant community monitoring and conservation, restoration planning, and project management. At New York City Parks, she monitors salt marshes, tracks rare and locally sensitive plant species, and reviews planting palettes for restoration and construction projects. She's also been part of, over the last year, the recent publications by Parks Natural Resources Group of 2 documents, the 4th edition of the Native Species Planting Guide and the Local Sensitive Species List. And before I give away too much about the publications, I'll hand it over to Clara.
Thanks so much, Katie. It's great to be here. Nice to see so many of your familiar names in the chat and some of your faces. As Katie said, I'm a plant ecologist with New York City Parks, and I'm really excited to tell you guys about these 2 publications um, tonight. So, um, I'm going to start with a native species planting guide and sort of give you guys some context. Some of you may be familiar with this document and the local law that requires us to do that. I'll highlight some of the specific changes that we included this year, what those what the updated list looks like. And then we also added a couple of new lists. And so I'll highlight some of those as well. And then I'll give you guys an overview of our first ever locally sensitive species list, give you some of the background, how we created it, how we hope it can be used, how you can engage with it. And also, of course, because we're all botanists and naturalists, highlight a few of the cool sensitive species that we've got, including Apios americana here on the screen, one of my favorite little vines that we see here and there in the city. And feel free to think of some questions. I'm happy to answer some questions towards the end. We'll have a Q&A, so there'll be plenty of time for that. You can either put them in the chat or just wait and towards the end, raise your hand. I think, right, Katie, everybody will be able to unmute themselves and ask. Great. Okay, so without further ado, I will get started. New York City Parks has been publishing a native species planting guide really since 1993. That was the first edition of what we call the Native Species Planting Guide. It was an actual physical document, and it was primarily written by Marge Gargiulo, a botanist for New York City Parks at the time. And it was really helpful for some of the internal restoration projects that were used. Again, it was a physical publication rather than an online publication. You know, it was 1993, which makes a lot of sense. So it wasn't widely disseminated to the public, right? Professionals had access to it, but not a whole lot of people in the public. And then the big thing that really changed our efforts with including more native plants in our natural resource plantings and in some of our horticultural settings was Local Law 11 of 2013, which is generally referred to as the biodiversity law. It includes a lot of different points, but the overall goal of this local law was to increase planting diversity, particularly in and around our natural areas. So New York City Parks manages about 12,000 acres of natural area in the city. These are places like Van Cortlandt Park and Pelham Bay Park, as opposed to the majority of Central Park or the majority of Prospect Park, right? There are parts of those two big charismatic parks that have some natural spaces like the Northwoods and the Ravine in Prospect Park. But by and large, those parks are more horticultural or in a lot of cases open lawn, right? So the natural resources group heavily focuses on our natural areas, including, like I said, places like Pelham Bay or now a little bit of Fresh Kills Park, all of our salt marshes. So the goal with the local law was to increase biodiversity in those spaces where the natural resources group was doing restoration work. We revised the goals set out were to revise our design, the city's design manual to highlight using native plants and increasing the diversity of planting palettes, and that we had to draft and publish a planting guide so that those designers and folks who were helping restore those spaces had the resources that they needed in order to implement these parts of the law to actually create the more diverse spaces, right? And because particularly on Staten Island and a little bit in northern Manhattan, we have these really unique places, these sort of historic zoning parts of our city zoning law that are directly adjacent to natural areas. This guide also had to be publicly available because people in those unique city zoning areas adjacent to natural areas have to follow the rule as well. So if they were going to landscape or if a building was going to do a significant amount of landscaping in one of these unique zoning areas, they would have to follow this local law 11 and use native plants and increase the diversity of the planting palette. So not only did we have to create an online version of a planting guide and a resource, but we had to update it every 5 years, and we had to make sure that it was available to a wide audience. And so the history is that law was passed in 2013. It took us roughly a year to get the publication online, to update Marge's original guide and determine what kind of information we wanted on it. And so really the publication that was put online in 2014, though it's technically the second edition of a New York City Parks native species planting guide, it's really the first one post the local law. And so we've only updated it a few times since then. And that first update in 2019 included some changes that I was also a part of. We really overhauled the stormwater infrastructure section, and we created a couple of unique lists for to help people understand what plants might survive the extensive deer herbivory pressure that people are seeing on Staten Island. Of course, in our opinion, no plant is deer resistant, but we at least came up with a list of species that we called them least preferred by deer. So that was a new list in the 2019 version. And then we have the fourth edition that came out this year. And of course, these publications that I'm talking about tonight are all online and open to you all in the public. Towards the end of the presentation, I can make sure I put the link to our publications page in the chat. But what you can see here on this slide, in addition to the lovely Nuttallanthus canadensis, is our table of contents. It's a really hefty document. It's over 300 pages in length. And it really, in my opinion, consists of three main sections. So we highlight some of the ecosystems of New York City, and that's what I really consider the first section. And in each of one of these subsections, so you can see we have coastal communities, wetland communities, successional communities, upland forest communities. And each one of those subsections, we have a variety of plant lists of species that we would typically find there. And they can be a resource, at least a starting space for someone who needs to create a planting palette for a habitat that might be similar to the ones that we mention in this guide. Then we have some additional planting lists. Particularly, you can see here things like native alternatives to common invasive plants, stormwater tolerant plants, that least preferred by deer section I mentioned. We have a pretty significant section on planting in the built environment. This is really geared towards those of you who are possibly working in disturbed soils or have unique projects that need tough plants. And then this year, under that one section, we have one new list under the planting in the built environment, and that's our pollinator habitat list. And this list, I'll talk a little bit more about, but it was based off of an ongoing Parks Department project that we have been piloting for the last few years. And excuse me, I would need to back up and say we actually have two new lists in that section because the Street Tree Beds project is another new project that we've been working on to find out what species can do well in those tough environments in New York City, our street tree beds. And it's a project that's been piloted by the Greenbelt Native Plant Center, or excuse me, now the Plant Ecology Center and Nursery. And so we had some initial data of species that have done well in there. Maybe some of you are familiar with that project or have participated in it, but we were able to get some data back from people and start to understand what could do well in there. So we have that list as well. And then wholly new this year, we have the common conditions of New York City list. And these are lists that I created based on some of Marge's original research. Another one of the books that she had written that is not often widely used anymore. But these are also conditions that I see designers constantly reaching out to me for suggestions that would do well in that section or in those conditions. And so I saw a need for another sort of set of lists, right? That people could use. So that's new this year. And then the third main section of the native species planting guide, really where the meat of the guide is, you can see from page 95 to about 520, is the native plant descriptions. So basically every species that is mentioned somewhere else in the guide, we have a full description of what the species can tolerate and where to use it and some other bits of information. So here are all of the additions that we created with the fourth edition. The addition of the coefficient of conservatism was one of these things. We added the C value into the native plant description section for each species. We updated some of the language, particularly around species that didn't evolve in the New York City region. We made sure that we had the most up-to-date common names for those. As I mentioned, the street tree beds and the plants for pollinator habitats and the plants for common conditions in New York City are three new lists that we created. So I want to spend some time here. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the coefficients of conservatism, but these are we call them C values for short, but it's essentially the estimation of a given species habitat fidelity. Or another way to think about it is a species' tendency to occur in a specific habitat. And these are values that are assigned by regional or in some cases state botanists who have extensive knowledge about where certain species are occurring in that region and how frequently they are occurring in a wide variety of habitat. The values themselves are assigned from 0 to a 10. And species on the lower end of the spectrum sort of indicate an ability to adapt to a wide variety of habitats or a wide just set of disturbance regimes, right? So things like Artemisia vulgaris, right? Our mugwort is going to have a 0. Pretty much all of the species that didn't evolve in our region have that 0 as a C value. And then we have, of course, some species that did evolve here that can just thrive in so many different habitats. And they're also going to have, a lower C value, something maybe between 1 and 3. And then at the other end of that spectrum, you have your 8s, your 9s, your 10s. And these are species that have a much narrower range of ecological tolerances. So they're not particularly able to handle a lot of anthropogenic disturbance and are therefore less likely to do really well in a restoration setting in New York City. And so one of the reasons I wanted to include these C values is because I think they can be a really helpful way to expand diversity, but also hedge your bets on what's actually going to be successful, right? If you want to add a really cool species to a planting palette, but it has a C value of a 10, maybe give it a try, but keep the number that you're using in that specific restoration project on the lower end. Maybe put 4 or 5 of them in. Don't put all of your eggs in that one basket because the likelihood of something with a 9 or a 10 C value surviving in New York City soils that are highly disturbed is pretty low, right? Worth giving a shot, but wouldn't want to make it the primary centerpiece of your garden or of your restoration project. And so this is a shift for us is thinking about using these C values in our restoration work, encouraging gardeners to look at them and consider this bit of ecological information when they're designing a garden or a restoration project. So here are some other reasons that we were really particularly interested in using them. They can be used to help us assess the quality and area of natural habitats as well. So we can look at the number of, we can look at all of the species in a restoration and sort of kind of get an indication of how well it's doing based on that average C value. As I said, they can guide planting decisions, but they should be used pretty high C value species should be used pretty judiciously. And overall, planting palettes should have some of that middle range C values, things in the 4 to 6 range, right? That's where you really want to experiment with adding some diversity to your palette, but also ensuring that you have a good amount of success for your garden or your restoration. Of course, here we have the federally endangered Amaranthus pumilus, the sea beach amaranth. It has a C value of 10, right? So it's a great example of a species that you can't just put in any restoration, right? It's a teeny tiny plant, so it's not super charismatic anyway. So you wouldn't necessarily reach for it when you're designing a planting palette. But if you did, it needs constant interaction with the soil, or excuse me, with the ocean. It really likes the rack line on the beach. It grows in pure sand and it needs that regular disturbance, that regular churning of the ocean waves to really survive in that area. And so if you tried to plant it even on the shore, but say on the sort of north side of the boardwalk in the Rockaways, the likelihood of survival is pretty low because that is already a very different condition than that rack line right on the beach, right? So it has that high C value, and we only, of course, have 1 or 2 populations of it in New York, and they're all along the Rockaways. So good example of a high C value species. So one of the other updates that we included, as I mentioned, that we updated some of the language of our, particularly of our species that didn't evolve in New York City. We tried to be very cautious and careful and conscientious about which common names we were using in the guide. The other two lists mentioned here are the street tree habitats and the plants for pollinator habitats, and I highly recommend you check those out. The street tree habitats project is one I mentioned that Pecan has been piloting, and the goal there is to ask community members to pick up plants from the Native Plant Center and plant them in street tree beds, and then give us some feedback, monitor them, essentially, some basic survival information about how these species did. And after a couple of years of data, we have a small list of species in the guide that we can recommend for those habitats, right? Things that are really tough and are able to survive. Most of them are herbaceous because that's, particularly what we're interested in planting in those areas. We don't want to plant too many other trees or shrubs in a single tree bed because we want the one tree planted there survive. So mostly what you'll find there are herbaceous plants. And then the other great list that we have in our planting in the built environment section this year is a list of species that our horticultural team, particularly Matthew Morrow, our director of horticulture, helped put together that was based on the successes of the Pollinator Place project. And this is a project he's been running for 3 or 4 years now, where gardeners within New York City parks in our sort of designed landscape, so outside of our natural areas, are increasing the diversity of some of the spaces that they manage. We have a very strict set of rules that the gardeners have to follow in order for them to qualify as a designated pollinator place. Once they've hit that threshold, they get a sign, and then that says it's a pollinator place, and then they can manage it slightly differently than some of the other um, sort of highly managed landscapes in our New York City parks. So they have their own set of rules to establish them, and then their own set of rules to maintain them. And they've been really successful so far. There's a combination of herbaceous and woody plants in that section. And this is sort of the first introduction to what's worked well, what Matthew and his team of gardeners has seen work well. And so again, for those of you who are gardeners in the five boroughs, interested in species that are tough in your backyard, these are a great resource, a great list of species for you to reference and get some ideas from. These are the other new lists that we developed this year. Open, wet to moist soil. So really sunny conditions, moist, wet soil. People are often looking for this in addition to bioswales and stormwater, the stormwater lists. They're looking at it for natural spaces. Open dry sites is another one that we're constantly asked to help come up with palettes for. Shaded moist to wet sites, disturbed forest understories, slope and soil stabilization projects, particularly in open sites. Now, I know most of you or many of you may not be designers, but these are great reference lists for those of you who might be, let's say, planting a garden in your backyard in New York City where you already have a bunch of trees. Then you can go to that disturbed forest understory, right? If you have a really shady backyard, that's a good list for you. If your backyard is wide open and there aren't any trees, the open dry sites might be a great resource for you. And then some of you may also manage some gardens in parks or open spaces, and you just sort of have to look at these conditions here and sort of determine which one might be best for you for a starting place. I really tried to focus on species that I knew would be available on the open market. So you'll notice there aren't as many species on here because we have trouble, or I'll say they might not be as creative as some of us botanists would like. But a lot of that is because these lists are certainly geared towards practicality, right? To being able to procure the species on the list so that a designer or a home gardener can say, oh, here's my list. I want to see how many of these species I can get. And by and large, you should be able to find most of them at some of the nurseries in our region. All right, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk now about the New York City locally sensitive species list. Um, the goal here of this list is to really highlight plant occurrence and distribution across the city, but also to highlight some of the threats that are faced by our flora. And we hope that that information can then to lead to wise management of different plant species across the city. And here are the three key questions that myself and my colleagues kept wondering about that really sort of spurred the creation of this list. What's actually here? Where are those species, and how prevalent are they across our landscape, and how do we prevent the next local extirpation? How do we make sure that we're not about to lose the last population of a species, right? There are so many projects that occur across New York City every day. It's absolutely mind-boggling, and more and more in the natural resources group, we're doing our own restorations to improve our forests and wetlands, and we're really good about checking what's there, right? But there are other agencies and organizations who are doing work that can affect parkland, but can affect non-parkland also, where those surveys are not quite as thorough. And so we want to make sure we're looking at the whole city, right? And we can't necessarily control whether or not a population gets removed if it's not on parks property, right? But we can advise a landowner to give them a heads up, like, we think you've got a population of a sensitive species on your property, and it's one of only a few left in the city. Are you aware of it? Right. So really trying to get a baseline of what's here, where are they, and how do we make sure they stay healthy? So how did we start? It's been a really long-running project, and I am really excited that it's published and that it's out there for folks. We started out with this 2018 publication from the New York Botanical Garden. This was the State of the City's Plants. It was published, as I said, in 2018, and it is a compilation of a few different floras. John Torrey's 1819 Flora of New York, Britton Stearns and Pogenberg's 1888 Flora of the area, and Norman Taylor's 1915 Flora. And so these three main references were checked and became sort of the basis of the checklist of New York City's plants. And so we started with that, and that was sort of our basis of our list. And so then we took that giant spreadsheet essentially, and we wanted to start tracking where all of these species occurred. And we were really looking particularly at natural areas, right? So not horticultural beds. And so that was our first filter. Like, where do they occur within the natural areas, not intentionally planted and managed spaces? Now, that being said, New York City, particularly the Natural Resources Group, has been impacting the landscape for a few decades now, right? And so we couldn't necessarily say that we're not going to count any planted populations, because the truth is, because NRG has been restoring populations of plants in the five boroughs since before online records were available, we didn't have all of the information at our hands to determine what spaces were planted or restored previously and what weren't. And so we also sort of said, well, if we've done a restoration and we've restored a plant population and it's doing well, it should count, right? We want to protect it going forward, especially if it's one that we have successfully restored, something that isn't frequent in New York City. And so we filtered to natural areas, but we didn't necessarily filter out previous restorations. We were willing to include all of those restoration projects in our count of populations. So once we had that list and sort of those general filters, we said, okay, well, what data do we have? And we started off with the New York City Guide to Native Plants. This was also one of the resources that I used to help create those lists in the Native Species Planting Guide and of common conditions. But in the late 90s and early 2000s, the Natural Resources Group had two excellent botanists on staff, Marge Gargiulo and Marielle Anzalone. And they together had about 2 decades of observations of plant populations across the 5 boroughs. So it's an incredibly rich amount of data. However, it was from the 90s and early 2000s before individuals had really good handheld GPS units and before our tracking was as advanced as even spreadsheets, right? And so in a lot of cases, Marge and Marielle's data was county based. It would list a species and it occurred in Richmond County. Well, that's all of Staten Island. So that's really challenging for us to use as knowing whether a population was present. Sometimes it was park based, but a lot less frequently it was trail based. That was about as fine level a detail as we got, and it wasn't very frequent. It also, of course, there were New York City Parks botanists. There were NRG botanists, so there were no records of species off of parks properties, and so we wanted to be sure to include that information as well. And so that's where we combined the data from Marge and Marielle with research grade observations on iNaturalist. And over the course of a year, we checked iNaturalist for research grade observations for every species that is on that original 2018 checklist, which is over 1,300 species, right? It's a huge list. It was a huge undertaking. This is partly why it took us so long to do this. And we did exclude some specific areas, right? As I mentioned, we were really focused on natural areas. So we excluded most of Central Park and Prospect Park. We excluded most of Riverside Park, and we excluded all of Brooklyn Bridge Park. Those were not considered in our number of populations. So then once we had the information on where each species occurred, we started with initial ranking. And we mimicked the best that we could the state ranks, the S values that occur for the flora for the states. So they were driven, and these initial ranks were driven essentially by data. How many locations were literally listed on our spreadsheet between those data sources, the historic botanist data and the iNaturalist data. And that gave us our initial rank. And then my colleague and I sat down and kept reviewing these ranks and refining them a little bit. In a lot of instances, we ended up using double ranks. And a lot of that is because, for example, if Marge and Marielle had listed that a species occurred in Richmond County and it was an herbaceous plant, well, in the late 90s and early 2000s, the deer population was a lot smaller. And most of the herbaceous plant populations on Staten Island have since been significantly impacted by over browsing by deer, right? And so we would say, okay, well, the data tells us it's in 4 different places on Staten Island, but we haven't seen it in 20 years, and we've been to all 4 of those places. So we think it's probably not occurring in as many places as the data is telling us. And so we would double rank that species, where the first rank is what the data tells us, and the second rank is what we actually suspect to be accurate. Other challenges that we had to deal with was nomenclature. It can be really challenging to reconcile what's a species. And so we did remove subspecies and varieties from the list. And that is a huge decision and possibly a controversial one because but we really felt that if we want to use this list for management purposes, the majority of our staff are not able to identify species to a subspecies level or don't have the time and resources to do that. And so ig- ig- getting rid of that subspecies sort of helps highlight, okay, if you see this in your project, flag it to the conservation team and we'll come check it out. So I'm not going to spend too much time here because I want to be able to have some time for Q&As. But this is the rank. Again, this is a publicly available document, so you can read all of the details of each rank in the document yourself. But as you see here, we did essentially mirror as best we could the state ranks. Um, and here are our goals for using the document. As I said, we really want to focus on being able to manage our plant populations. We want to look for those species that need our help the most, right? That are really sensitive within the 5 boroughs. And we want to make sure we're protecting them during restoration projects or alerting other land managers that they're present on their property. We want to be able to use this list in the actual restorations, have it help drive our planting palette decisions and guide seed collection and plant production efforts, right? I really want to combine the use of C values to guide restoration projects with our locally sensitive species list and say, okay, we have 15 species that are L2 but have a C value between 4 and 6. And so those are species that could likely survive in our area and could also really benefit from a boost in restoring their numbers across the city. And then we also really want to use this list as a way to engage you all, to engage the community, to highlight the importance of your efforts to contribute to our understanding of our flora. We could not have done this without all of you who have contributed to iNaturalist. The data set is incredibly rich, and it is what allowed us to create this list. And we want to ask for your help locating these populations. The list is definitely meant to be flexible. We didn't get everything right. You may have some significant disagreements about what rank we have, and I'd be happy to hear about it. Right? Send me an email and say, hey, I think there's more populations of this, or hey, I actually haven't seen this in a lot of these places. We didn't publicize the locations for these species. It's literally a checklist. But you can always reach out to me and ask, do we know about whatever population? We can check and say, oh, we don't, we should add that. Or yes, we do, and we're working to protect it. So in our last few minutes, I just want to highlight a few cool bits of data that came out of this. We have 934 species of the roughly 1,400 species of our flora that are ranked LH to L2. And that, as you can see here, includes the double ranks. That's 64% of our flora we consider relatively sensitive. That's a big chunk. And we're just starting to dive into managing those on a species level. We think about 30% of the flora is historic. We have 6 species that the data might tell us are historic, but we may actually have seen recent populations of and haven't logged them in our official data sets yet. So you can see some of the other percentages here. Those L1 and L2s, about 500 species. Those I think are ones we should really focus on trying to increase their populations of, and which one of those have C values that might allow for restoration. On this more sensitive list, we have 40 trees, which is a pretty significant number of trees, but by and large, the most sensitive species are herbaceous, right? We have almost 550 forbs, and about 250 graminoids. These are big groups of plants that we could start bringing back into our restoration projects and create new homes for. Uh, Here's a bit more detail on how the data breaks down. Plants in the Cyperaceae, it is one of the more extensive and diverse families in New York City, has the most sensitive species in it, right? Shortly thereafter, you have the grasses and the asters. These are generally really big species, or really big families. So it's not surprising that we have a significant number of sensitive species in those families. And then the orchids, of course, stand out as well. We have a good number of orchids in New York City, but the majority of them have very few populations left. A great example is here, Cypripedium acale. It's an L2. It's a state. It's an S4, so it's wide, fairly widespread and secure across the state. But in New York City, we only have a couple of populations of it left, right? Opposite story here with Cyperus echinatus. It's a S1. It's an L4. We have a lot of populations. Of course, we're still going to protect the species, but it's another interesting data point. A bit of breakdown on the wetland indicator status for some of the species that are really sensitive. New York City has lost a significant amount of its wetland habitat since the 1800s. A lot of our wetlands have been filled and developed. And as a result, a lot of our wetland species are sensitive or are historic, right? 259 species that are obligates are ranked LH to L2. That's a pretty significant percentage of our flora that is sensitive, that has to live in a wetland, right? 16% are mostly occurring in wetlands, our fac-wet species. 11% are facultative, and then we start moving up the line into those upland conditions. Here's that last data point that I mentioned, applying these C values to our locally sensitive species list. 151 species of that 900, and I can't remember, 40 or so, have this really high C value. And these are species that we're less likely to be able to really reintroduce into our restoration or horticultural projects. Those seven C values, 7 to 8, 297 species. Again, we could have some real challenges keeping those alive in our large scale restorations. Maybe some of them could be appropriate for horticultural settings. And then we have 370 species that have pretty flexible tolerances for where they can survive. They're relatively able to withstand disturbance and anthropogenic soil conditions. And yet they're LH to L2, and we don't have that many populations of them left. So let's focus our restoration efforts on that 300 or some subset of that 370 species, and start increasing our planting palette diversity and our restoration diversity right there. So let's start collecting them. Let's start learning how to propagate them if we don't already know, and managing them in both horticultural and natural conditions. And then obviously we have another 98 in that 0 to 3 range that we can also target for that effort. All right, I went through some of that fairly quickly because I wanted to make sure there's some time for questions. And if there aren't, I can go back and expand a little bit on some things. But those are our two big publications of 2025. Again, they're all available online. And I'd be happy for feedback on either of them. We'll have to update the Native Species Planting Guide again in now 4 years. I am hoping to make it an online, like a filterable website. So that's kind of in the works, slowly but surely, so that you could go and sort of put your conditions in to a bunch of check boxes, and the list would come out so that it's not a 540-page document to scan through. So please, I'm happy to hear your questions or ideas about either of those documents in the future. I'm happy to put my email in the chat to that end. So yeah, questions. Let's see. Should I look at the chat first?
Thank you so much. Thank you for like all the work that you've done and the other folks at Parks to work on this and for coming to talk to us today. Um, yeah, Dawn, I see your question in the chat about the planting. I don't know if you want to unmute and um talk about it. Otherwise, we can maybe read it out.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Hi, Claire.
Hey, John.
This is just, I get these references occasionally to PDFs of new studies periodically. I don't know what AI determines that they're going to send to me, but I get them, and every now and then I look at them. And there have been a couple of studies recently that relate to trying to restore areas with native plants by seeding that suggests that when we try to reseed with native plants that exactly fit the niche or the niche that the alien species are in, that's usually not very successful, and that there seems to be a greater success rate when plants that are slightly outside of the perfect plants are seeded there. And I was wondering if you had read any of these and have any comments about it.
Um, it's been a while since I've read a lot of scientific papers. I think the biggest challenge we face in that regard is and you sort of mentioned this in the chat, is the existing seed bank in the soil, right? And how do we continue to manage what's going to come up after? And we can target our planting palette to help to help sort of hedge or outcompete the things we don't want, but often that means we've seen reducing diversity, planting a few really tough species that we want, putting that in the seed mix or putting those in plugs and letting those 4 or 5 plants that evolved here that we know are really tough do the work. And that often comes at a cost of having, a higher diversity of a planting palette than we'd really want. But because we can't go in and garden each one of our restoration areas, that's our best bet as a way to sort of slow the introduction of the species that we don't want. So I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but that's sort of the best I've got at the moment.
Just wanted an opinion.
Yeah. Someone in the chat asked about non-city, what does it look like when we approach a non-city landowner? So cemeteries have not reached out to us. We have also not really reached out to any cemeteries about this yet. Again, the list is still relatively new. I don't know how many folks know about it. I know that the Native Plant Center has a pretty good relationship with folks from Greenwood Cemetery. So I know they're doing really great work to increase diversity out at the in sort of some of the spaces of Greenwood. In terms of, and I happen to know that they have some really cool, unique native plants growing out of some of the mausoleums there. So there are populations of plants on those properties. The first group of landowners that we've really worked with are other city agencies that we already have relationships with. So we haven't really reached out yet to private landowners where we know that some populations exist. We're starting with our sister agencies and saying, hey, DEC, did you know this was on your property? Right? Or other agencies that National Park Service is another good example, and hopefully we'll be coordinating with state parks as well. So we're starting with the folks that we've got contacts with, and hopefully moving on to there. If any of you are fellow landowners and are curious if there are populations on your property, I put my email in the chat, so please feel free to reach out.
I had a question. You mentioned the street tree habitats project, which sounds like a very cool way for people to get involved and maybe like inform some of this information about our native plants. Is that something people can still do, or is there anything similar going on that people can get involved in that way?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, I don't have the best answer. I can reach out to the Native Plant Center, the Plant Ecology Center, and ask. It's been very funding dependent. And I don't remember, I think they have a new fellow this year. And so I think they're going to be distributing plants again. Um, and so I can find out and then pass that information along to you, Katie, and you can share it with the membership with how they might be able to sign up. It looks like someone in the chat is doing it this year, that they have 4 beds on our block, but it is a way to get plants from the Plant Ecology Center, put them in your street tree beds and monitor them. I just don't know how many new beds they're accepting each year. Since the fellowship has again, it's been grant funding dependent, and I don't know what the exact status is right now, but I will follow up for sure, and you can pass that along to the membership.
Kathleen, do you want to go
Any other
ahead?
questions in our last few minutes?
Yeah, go ahead, Kathleen. Do you want to unmute?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks so much, Clara, for all this information. It's terrific. I'm with Friends of Tompkins Square and just about the street tree habitats. About 3 weeks ago, I met with people who were trying to get a community list of everyone involved with the street tree habitats. And so I provided, just with the Lower East Side and East Village, about 70 people who I know are involved with the street tree habitat. And apparently the funding for 2026 has improved, I would say. And one of the goals that they're actively working on is, one, to get feedback from everyone who's already involved. And so there's easily, well, I had 70 alone on my list. So the other thing they're going to try to do is to expand the actual tree beds themselves, make it easier to plant. So I think I forget the name, I forget their names, but there's active work going to
Great.
happen to get more volunteers, especially so many people are doing this and they just don't have a good list of who they are. And
Yeah.
the other thing is, people are really knowledgeable about what's been doing well in these tree beds. So
Great.
that's another thing they're trying to figure out.
I had thought that the funding was restored, but I didn't want to give the wrong idea. So I'm glad someone else has hedged that way. And again, I can follow up with some details and contact information so that all of you interested can hear it. I want to quickly just answer a couple of questions that came in the chat. I know we're pretty much at 7. One is the New York Flora Atlas the best source for the C values? And I would say yes, for the state of New York, that's going to be your best, most comprehensive resource. And a quick plug for those of you who may not be familiar for the Flora Atlas, it's generally a great resource. It's also a website that is managed and maintained by the New York Flora Association, a similar group of like-minded botanists across the state of New York, of which I am a member of the board, so full disclosure, but great plug for the organization. For those of you not familiar with it, I recommend you check out the Atlas and check out the Flora Association at large. And then the other question here at the bottom is, are there any thoughts about involving community gardens or smaller non-native areas, parks involved with more specialized plantings? And the answer is yes, I think so. I think there is a species on this list for any space in the city, right? We have sensitive species. We want to increase their populations. We want to be careful about how we do that. But I do think that community gardens and horticultural spaces are are available for that effort to maintain our plants. If we excluded those and only included our natural areas to manage our flora or to highlight certain species, I think we would overall be at a loss. They're a great way to engage the community, educate people about the state of our flora, and also help ensure plants are persisting in the 5 boroughs, and then therefore that their pollinators are also, right? If they're the only place they're going to survive, we need to have that resource for certain pollinators. And so I, for one, am open to that idea. And again, if you have further questions about it, feel free to send me an email.
Thank you so much, Clara, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. If you want to share this talk, we have recorded it and it will be up on the Torrey Botanical YouTube page. You can see recordings of a bunch of past lectures. Please do consider becoming a member. You can find more information at torreybotanical.org. And thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks so much.